Magnus Kael walked into his daughter's academy hall, expecting to observe her academic progress as part of his diplomatic visit. What he found instead would challenge everything he'd built in 20 years of fragile peace. His daughter, Naomi, was on her knees on the ancient stone floor, gathering scattered food with trembling hands. A teacher in a black gown stood 15 feet away, arms crossed, watching with cold indifference. Magnus didn't roar. He didn't shift. He just stood there, his warrior's armor suddenly feeling like a cage. Because in that moment, an Alpha King's worst nightmare became real, and a promise he made to protect the vulnerable shattered in front of him. What happened next brought 22 Wolfpack Alphas to that academy's gates. But they didn't come for bloodshed. They came for something the ancient human families never expected. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. It was a hall that smelled of old parchment and beeswax candles, the kind of place where history and tradition conspired to make everything feel both sacred and suffocating. The midday meal had ended. Most of the students were already in their afternoon lectures. But in a corner near the arched stone doorway, a scene was unfolding that no child should ever have to face. Naomi Kael, 9 years old, with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's fierce determination buried deep beneath fear, was on her knees. Her modern lunch tray lay overturned against the medieval stone wall, its contents scattered: a bruised pear, a crushed piece of bread, a small bottle of juice creating dark rivulets across the ancient tile. Standing nearby was Mrs. Helena Dorsey, 52 years old, descendant of one of the Academy's founding families, her black academic gown pressed sharp as judgment. "Clumsy creatures should learn to handle their own messes," she said, not to Naomi directly, but to the air itself, as though the child were already beneath acknowledgement. "Perhaps your kind would fare better in less refined institutions." Naomi didn't answer. She had learned the terrible arithmetic of survival. How stillness could be mistaken for compliance. How silence could make cruelty lose interest faster than protest. She reached for a piece of bread soaked in juice, her small hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. 15 feet away, Mrs. Dorsey remained. She observed. She judged. She said nothing more. The heavy oak door creaked open and Magnus Kael stepped through. He was imposing, 6'4", dressed in the formal black armor and flowing robes of his station, his long dark hair framing a face that had negotiated treaties and ended wars. He had come to observe her scholarship presentation, to show the human dignitaries that shifter children could thrive in their prestigious academy. The kind of diplomatic gesture powerful families use to maintain peace. The scroll in his hand slipped slightly when he saw her. His body went rigid. Every instinct screamed for transformation, for the primal justice of fang and claw. He could feel his wolf clawing at the cage of his discipline, demanding release, demanding retribution. The anti-shift wards embedded in the academy walls pressed against his power like iron bands, but it wasn't the wards that held him. It was something worse. Naomi looked up. Relief was not in her expression. There was shame instead, the kind that makes a child believe she is somehow at fault for the cruelty inflicted upon her. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the stone floor.
"I'm sorry."
I dropped the tray again. Again. The word struck him like a silver blade to the chest. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Dorsey. Her arms uncrossed. Her posture stiffened with defensive indignation. "Your Majesty," she said, voice thinly courteous but edged with contempt. "The Academy maintains high standards. All students must learn accountability, regardless of their background." Perhaps if young Naomi weren't so distracted by her dual nature, she would be less accident-prone. "How long?" Magnus interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I beg your pardon? How long has my daughter been accident-prone in your care?" Mrs. Darcy's silence answered more plainly than any confession. The slight lift of her chin, the pursing of her lips, she believed herself justified. Magnus did not unleash the wolf. He did not call down the rage that every fiber of his being demanded. Instead, he crossed the hall and knelt beside Naomi on the cold stone floor, his armored form graceful despite its weight, and began to help her gather the scattered food. "It's all right, little moon," he murmured, using the private name he'd called her since birth. "I'm here now, and this is never, ever going to happen again." He meant it, and he did not yet know how vast that promise would have to become. Magnus had signed the Treaty of Thornhaven 20 years ago in a hall not unlike this one, surrounded by human diplomats who looked at him the way Mrs. Darcy looked at his daughter now. The terms were simple on parchment, brutal in practice. Shifters would integrate into human society. They would send their children to human institutions. They would suppress their nature in public spaces, wear their human skin like a uniform, and in exchange, the old hunts would end. The silver bullets would be melted down. The ancient blood feuds would fade into history. It was peace purchased with pride, and Magnus had believed the price worth paying. The Academy's anti-shift wards had been presented as a safety measure during the negotiations. Human families feared shifter children losing control during examination stress or schoolyard disputes, transforming in moments of fear or anger. The wards were supposed to be protective, a gentle suppression field that would help young shifters maintain their human form during the vulnerable years of learning control. The human delegates had sworn the wards were humane, tested, approved by both human and shifter physicians. What they hadn't mentioned was how it would feel. How the constant pressure against a child's true nature would be like wearing clothes 3 sizes too small every waking moment. How Naomi would come home each evening with exhaustion that sleep never quite fixed, her wolf whimpering beneath her skin, unable to stretch, unable to breathe. Magnus had noticed the changes slowly, the way all terrible things happen to the people you love. Naomi had been bright once, curious and fierce. She'd asked 1,000 questions about everything, challenged him at chess, laughed with her whole body. 6 months into the academy, she'd grown quiet. Her questions became fewer. Her laughter, when it came, sounded like something she'd learned to perform rather than something that erupted from joy. He told himself it was normal. Adjustment. Growing up. The natural mellowing that came with education and maturity. He'd been a fool. A king who could see political maneuvering from 100 miles away, but missed the dimming light in his own daughter's eyes. The treaty forbade him from removing her without cause that could be proven before a joint council. Vague complaints about unhappiness or cultural adjustment weren't sufficient. The Academy's reputation was impeccable, its graduates influential across both human and shifter territories. To withdraw Naomi would be seen as a political statement, a rejection of integration, and it would endanger the hundreds of other shifter children now attending human schools across the continent. So, he had smiled at diplomatic functions. He had praised the Academy's curriculum in speeches. He had assured other shifter parents that their children were safe, that this was the future, that sacrifice in one generation would mean freedom for the next. And all the while, his daughter had been on her knees, picking up food while teachers watched, her wolf pressed so far down inside her that she'd forgotten how to bare her teeth even when she should. Magnus waited until they were in the carriage, the Academy's stone walls receding behind them, before he spoke. Naomi sat pressed against the velvet cushions, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. She was trying to make herself smaller, he realized. Trying to disappear. "Tell me," he said quietly. Not a command. An invitation. She shook her head, eyes fixed on her hands. "Little Moon," he murmured, using the name that had always made her smile. "I cannot fix what I do not understand." The tears came then, silent and devastating. "It will make it worse," she whispered. "If you get angry, if you do something, they'll know what we are." They'll say shifters are violent. They'll say we don't belong. And all the other children, Sarah and Thomas and little Maya, they'll suffer because of me. Magnus felt something crack inside his chest. His 9-year-old daughter was carrying the weight of an entire species on her shoulders, choosing silence over safety because she'd learned that her pain mattered less than political stability. "That is not your burden to carry," he said, and the edge in his voice made her flinch. He softened immediately, reaching for her hand. "I'm not angry at you, Naomi. I'm angry for you. There's a difference." She looked up at him then, those eyes so like her mother's, and the words came tumbling out like a dam breaking. It had started small. Comments about how shifters smelled like wet dogs. How her handwriting was too primitive, her manners too rough. Evan Marsden, whose family claimed lineage back to the Academy's founding, had dubbed her Wolfspawn, and it had stuck. The other ancient blood children used it like punctuation. Wolfspawn needs to sit in the back. Wolfspawn shouldn't touch the library books. Wolfspawn ate like an animal. And when she'd reported it, first to Mrs. Dorsey, then to Headmaster Wycliffe himself, she'd been told that integration required resilience. That shifter children needed thicker skin if they wanted to succeed in human society. That perhaps she was being oversensitive, reading malice into innocent teasing. Mrs. Dorsey said that if I couldn't handle a little roughhousing, maybe the Academy wasn't the right fit, Naomi said, her voice barely audible. She said my kind often struggled with the demands of refined education. That it wasn't personal, just biological. Magnus' hands tightened on the edge of the seat, his knuckles white. The anti-shift wards no longer pressed against him here, and his wolf surged close to the surface, demanding blood. But Naomi was watching him with terrified hope, needing him to be the king, not the beast. "How many times has your tray been knocked over?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. 11, she said immediately, and the specificity of it, the fact that she'd counted, that each humiliation was etched into her memory, nearly broke him. And the faculty? They never see it, or they say they didn't. Evan waits until they look away, and afterward, they say, I should be more careful. Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his mind already moving through the implications. This wasn't isolated cruelty. This was systematic, institutional. The ancient blood families still controlled the Academy's board, still held the purse strings and the appointments. They'd agreed to the treaty with their mouths while their hearts remained in the old wars, and now they were teaching their children that shifters were lesser, that integration meant subjugation, not equality. The treaty itself was at risk. If other shifter parents learned their children faced similar treatment, the fragile peace would shatter. You were right about one thing, Magnus said finally. I cannot simply unleash my rage. That would be easy, and it would change nothing. He met his daughter's eyes. But you are wrong about another. This will not make things worse for you. This ends now. The moon was full when Magnus lit the beacon fire on Thornhaven Peak. Within the hour, they began to arrive. 22 alphas, each ruling their own territory, each commanding their own packs. They came as wolves through the forest paths and as humans on horseback, drawn by the ancient summons that had not been called in 15 years. The last time had been war. They gathered in the great hall of Magnus' stronghold, a circular chamber where 23 chairs stood in perfect equality around a massive stone table.
No throne, no hierarchy.
Just the council that had survived centuries by trusting one another's judgment. Gareth Ironpaw arrived first, scarred and gray-muzzled, smelling of pine and old battles. Then Lyssa Nightrunner, whose territory bordered 3 human kingdoms and whose political instincts were sharper than any blade. One by one they came, until all 22 stood waiting, their combined power making the air itself feel heavy with potential violence. Magnus did not make them wait. My daughter was on her knees today, picking food off the floor while a human teacher watched and did nothing. This has happened 11 times. The faculty calls her wolf spawn and tells her to be grateful for the opportunity to learn among her betters. The growls started immediately, low and dangerous. Gareth's hand went to the axe at his belt. Give me 20 warriors, and that academy burns by dawn. No, Magnus said, and the word carried absolute authority. That is exactly what they expect from us. What they've always believed about us. That we're animals who respond to injury with mindless violence. Then what? Lissa demanded, her amber eyes flashing. We signed the treaty in good faith. We've sent our children into their schools, suppressed our nature, bent our necks to their laws. And this is how they honor the peace? By teaching our young to be ashamed. They honor nothing, Magnus agreed. The ancient blood families never wanted integration. They wanted subjugation with a prettier name. The treaty was always a leash to them, never a bridge. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the stone table. But they made a mistake. They taught us their systems, their laws, their treaties. And now we're going to use that knowledge to take everything they thought they controlled. The hall went silent. The alphas leaned closer. The Academy's endowment comes from 12 ancient blood families, Magnus continued. We have pack members in every major financial institution across the continent. We can trace every donation, every under-the-table payment, every bribe that's kept the old guard in power. Lissa, your territory includes the royal archives. You have access to the original treaty documents, the ones that outline consequences for treaty violations. Lissa's smile was sharp as a knife, including provisions for institutional discrimination. And we have something else, Magnus said quietly. We have documentation. 11 incidents, meticulously recorded by a 9-year-old who thought it was her fault. We have witnesses, other shifter children, too afraid to speak but who will, if their alphas stand behind them. We have evidence of systematic corruption that violates not just the spirit of the treaty, but the letter of the law. You want to bury them in paperwork and politics, Gareth said slowly, understanding dawning. Destroy them with their own rules. I want to dismantle them so completely that no academy, no institution, no ancient blood family ever makes another shifter child kneel again, Magnus said. I want to show them that we're not just strong enough to burn their buildings. We're sophisticated enough to take them apart piece by piece, legally and publicly, in a way they can never rebuild. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Gareth pulled his hand away from his axe and placed it palm down on the stone table. I'm with you. One by one, 22 hands joined his. The vote was unanimous. They arrived at dawn, when the mist still clung to the academy's stone walls and the first bell for morning lessons had not yet rung. 23 figures emerged from the fog like something out of legend, walking in perfect formation across the manicured grounds. Not wolves. Not warriors in battle dress. Just men and women in formal attire, moving with the kind of synchronized precision that spoke of absolute unity. But there was no mistaking what they were. Power radiated from them like heat from a forge. It was in the way they moved, the way the morning birds fell silent as they passed, the way the mist itself seemed to part before them. Each alpha wore the formal regalia of their pack. Gareth in iron gray with his clan sigil, Lissa in midnight blue with silver embroidery, Magnus at the center in his black armor and flowing robes. They were diplomatic, legal, impeccably civilized, and absolutely terrifying. The groundskeeper saw them first. He dropped his rake and ran. By the time the alphas reached the main courtyard, the academy's windows were filling with faces. Students pressed against the glass. Faculty members appeared in doorways, their expressions shifting from confusion to recognition to barely concealed panic. The ancient blood families knew what an alpha looked like. Their grandparents had fought against these bloodlines in the old wars. Some nightmares don't fade with treaty ink. The 23 alphas formed a semicircle in the center of the courtyard, directly in front of the main entrance.
They did not speak.
They did not threaten. They simply stood, their presence a declaration that could not be ignored. We are here. We are watching. And we are not leaving. Headmaster Wycliffe emerged from the main hall, flanked by Mrs. Dorsey and two board members Magnus recognized from diplomatic functions. Wycliffe's face had gone the color of old parchment. He approached with the careful steps of a man walking through a field of sleeping serpents. Your Majesty, he began, his voice cracking slightly. This is most irregular. If you wish to schedule a meeting— I am not here for a meeting, Magnus said quietly. His voice carried across the courtyard without needing to be raised. I am here to ensure my daughter understands something she should never have had to question. He turned, and his gaze found the window where Naomi stood, third floor, east wing, her small face pressed against the glass. Their eyes met across the distance. Magnus raised his hand, and 22 other hands rose in perfect unison, a gesture of acknowledgement, of protection, of pact. Naomi's hand came up slowly, hesitantly, pressing against the window glass. She needs to know, Magnus continued, still looking at his daughter, that she is not alone, that when she is hurt, her entire pack feels it, that there are 23 alphas who will stand between her and anyone who believes she should kneel. He finally turned back to Wycliffe. We will be conducting a full review of the Academy's compliance with the Treaty of Thornhaven. We have forensic accountants examining your financial records. We have legal scholars reviewing your disciplinary procedures. We have witnesses prepared to testify about systematic discrimination. He paused. And we have all day. The color drained further from Wycliffe's face. Behind him, Mrs. Dorsey had gone rigid, her earlier smugness replaced by something that looked dangerously close to fear. This is absurd, one of the board members sputtered. You can't just— We can, Lissa said, speaking for the first time, her voice like silk over steel. And we are. The treaty is quite clear about institutional violations. Would you like us to cite the specific clauses? The board member closed his mouth. The alphas remained standing, a silent wall of consequence, as the Academy's carefully constructed facade began to crack. The boardroom had never been designed for this many witnesses. By mid-morning, it was standing room only, packed with Academy board members, faculty representatives, and the 3 shifter investigators Magnus had brought. Lissa stood by the door, her presence alone enough to ensure no one tried to leave early. Outside, the remaining alphas maintained their vigil in the courtyard, and beyond them, the first reporters had begun to gather at the gates. News traveled fast when 23 alphas assembled. Elena Riversong, Magnus' chief financial investigator, spread the first documents across the broad oak table. She was slight, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of methodical patience that made her absolutely ruthless at untangling corruption. Let's begin with the endowment fund, she said pleasantly. Specifically, the Marsden Family Trust. Cornelius Marsden, Evan's grandfather and the board's treasurer, stiffened. The Marsden Trust is a matter of public record. There's nothing suspicious about a charitable education fund? Elena interrupted, her smile sharp. You're right. Until we examined where the money actually goes. She slid a ledger across the table. 43% of the Marsden Trust's annual disbursement is allocated to what you call cultural preservation initiatives. That's a lovely phrase. Would you like to tell everyone what it actually funds? The silence was damning.
No.
Elena continued. Then I will. It funds the Academy's anti-shift wards. Specifically, the maintenance and enhancement of ward strength in areas where shifter students congregate. Your charitable trust is paying to suppress shifter children more effectively than the treaty permits. She looked up. That's a treaty violation, by the way. Article 7, Section 3. Headmaster Wycliffe's hands trembled as he reached for the document. This must be an accounting error. It's not, said Marcus Thornwood, Magnus legal scholar, stepping forward with a stack of files that hit the table with a satisfying thud. We have 12 years of records. The pattern is consistent and deliberate, but it gets better. He opened the top file. The Academy receives substantial funding from 5 ancient blood families, all of whom have treaty-protected status as integration supporters. That status comes with tax benefits and diplomatic privileges. But according to these internal memos, which we obtained through perfectly legal discovery channels, those same families have been lobbying to restrict shifter enrollment quotas and implement mandatory behavioral assessments that coincidentally fail shifter children at 3 times the rate of human children. One of the board members stood abruptly. This is slander. You have no right to. We have every right, Lyssa said from the doorway, her voice cutting through the protest. Article 12 of the treaty establishes mutual oversight in integrated institutions. You should have read the fine print before you signed. Elena wasn't finished. And then there's the disciplinary record. She pulled out another file, this one thicker than the rest. In the past 3 years, shifter students have been disciplined for aggressive behavior at rates 17 times higher than human students. The infractions include such dangerous acts as displaying teeth, maintaining prolonged eye contact, and, my personal favorite, emanating threatening presence. She looked directly at Mrs. Dorsey. You filed that last one against a 6-year-old. Mrs. Dorsey's face had gone pale. The child was growling at. The child was humming, Elena said flatly. We have witnesses. 3 human students and 2 faculty members who were in the room. You claimed a shifter child was growling to justify a 3-day suspension. The child was humming a lullaby her mother taught her. The room erupted. Board members spoke over each other, voices rising in defense and accusation. Through the windows, camera flashes began to pop. The reporters had multiplied. Magnus could see both human press and supernatural media gathering, the kind of combined attention that would make this story impossible to bury. He let the chaos build for a moment longer, then spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but something in it made every other sound stop. The evidence is compiled. The violations documented. The pattern undeniable. He looked at each board member in turn. You have systematically abused your treaty protections to perpetuate the very prejudice the treaty was designed to end. And you did it using our children as your weapons. Outside, more cameras arrived. The tribunal had become public. Magnus let the silence settle like snow after an avalanche. The evidence lay spread across the table in neat, damning stacks. Outside the windows, the alphas remained motionless in their formation, and beyond them, cameras continued to flash. The world was watching now. Whatever happened in this room would ripple through every integrated institution across the continent. He stood, and the simple act commanded absolute attention. His armor caught the light, black and silver and utterly uncompromising. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had ended wars and built treaties, who had chosen discipline over destruction at every crucial moment, and who had finally reached the limit of his patience. 20 years ago, I signed a treaty in good faith, Magnus began. I believed that integration could work, that human and shifter children could learn side by side, that prejudice could fade through proximity and shared experience. I believed that institutions like this academy would honor the spirit of that agreement, not just the letter. He paused, his gaze moving across each board member's face. I was wrong to trust you with that responsibility. Cornelius Marsden opened his mouth to speak, but Magnus continued as if he hadn't existed. You were given a sacred duty, to educate all children equally, to protect the vulnerable, To build the future we promised when we laid down our weapons and chose peace. His voice hardened. Instead, you used treaty protections as a shield to continue the very discrimination the treaty forbade. You took our children's tuition, accepted our diplomatic concessions, smiled at integration ceremonies, and then you taught your students that shifter children were lesser, that they were wolf spawn who should be grateful to kneel. Mrs. Dorsey made a small sound of protest. Magnus turned to her, and she shrank back in her chair. You watched my daughter on her knees 11 times, he said quietly. 11 times. You stood by while a child was humiliated. And you told yourself it was building character. That she needed to learn her place. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. You forgot that her place is as my daughter. As a child under pack protection. As a student who deserved your care, not your contempt. He turned back to the full board. The evidence is overwhelming and public. Misappropriation of funds. Treaty violations. Systematic discrimination. The media has it all now. Both human and shifter authorities will be investigating. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. But you have one opportunity to control how this ends for you personally. You can't force us to resign, one of the board members said, but there was no conviction in it. No, Magnus agreed. But I can make very clear what happens if you don't. He straightened. If you resign today, you lose your positions. If you force this to a formal tribunal, you lose your positions, your treaty protections, your diplomatic status, and quite possibly face criminal charges for fraud and child endangerment. And every day that you refuse to step down, 23 alphas will stand in that courtyard, and every news outlet on the continent will continue asking why. Lissa stepped forward from her position by the door, holding a stack of papers. We've prepared resignation letters for each of you, predated to this morning, before the evidence became public. You'll be able to claim you stepped down voluntarily once irregularities were discovered. It's more dignity than you deserve. And, Mrs. Dorsey, someone asked quietly. Mrs. Dorsey's contract is terminated effective immediately, Magnus said, for gross negligence in her duty of care. She will never work in an educational institution again. Mrs. Dorsey stood, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. This is outrageous. I have tenure. I have rights. You had a responsibility, Magnus interrupted. You chose to ignore it. Now you face the consequences. One by one, the board members reached for the resignation letters. The pressure was too great, the evidence too damning, the cost of resistance too high. Within 20 minutes, every signature was collected. Magnus gathered the documents, his expression unreadable. The academy will reform or it will close. That choice belongs to whoever comes after you. But they will do so knowing that shifter children are not to be tolerated. They are to be protected. And 23 alphas are watching. The academy's reconstruction took 3 months. The interim board, overseen by both human and shifter authorities, moved with unprecedented speed. The first change was the establishment of the Joint Advisory Council, with equal representation from human and shifter communities, given full authority over disciplinary procedures, curriculum development, and faculty hiring. Every decision would now pass through eyes that understood both worlds. The anti-shift wards were recalibrated by a team of human and shifter mages working in concert, reducing their suppressive effect to what the treaty had actually specified, a gentle dampener for moments of high emotion, not the crushing weight that had suffocated Naomi's spirit. Students reported feeling as though they could breathe for the first time in years. But the most visible change was the cultural center. It rose on the academy's east lawn, a building of stone and timber that somehow looked both ancient and new. The Wolfpack Council had donated the funds, and architects from 12 territories had contributed designs. It housed a library of shifter history, meeting rooms for student groups, and a great hall where both human and shifter traditions could be celebrated without hierarchy or judgment. Above the entrance, carved in stone, were words Magnus had chosen himself: strength in unity, safety in truth. On the day of the center's dedication, Magnus stood with Naomi at the edge of the crowd. She wore her academy uniform, but she stood differently now. Shoulders back, head high, the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes for months had finally begun to fade. "Sarah asked me to help her with her arithmetic today," Naomi said quietly, watching the other students gather for the ceremony. Sarah was human, from one of the old families, and her willingness to ask a shifter child for help felt like its own small revolution. "And Thomas wants to learn about pack structure for his history project." "And Evan?" Magnus asked carefully. "Gone," Naomi said simply. "His family withdrew him. Grandfather Marsden's resignation made too much noise." She looked up at her father. "Some of the other ancient blood kids still don't like us. But they're not cruel anymore. They know someone's watching." 23 someones, Magnus thought. The Alphas had maintained a rotating presence at the academy for the first 2 months, a visible reminder that shifter children were no longer unprotected. Even now, with the reforms in place, pack representatives visited weekly. The ceremony began. The new headmistress, a human woman named Catherine Wells who had spent 20 years teaching in integrated schools, spoke about bridges and futures. Then Lissa, representing the Wolf Pack Council, unveiled a plaque dedicating the center to all children who had suffered in silence. Magnus watched his daughter's face as the crowd applauded. And then, something extraordinary happened. Naomi laughed. Not the careful, performed laughter she'd learned to use as camouflage, but genuine, unrestrained joy as a group of her classmates, both human and shifter, called her over to see the new library. She hesitated, looking up at Magnus for permission. He nodded, and she ran, her brown tunic billowing behind her, her voice joining the happy chaos of children who finally felt safe enough to simply be children. Magnus felt something settle in his chest, a tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. This was what the treaty had promised. Not performance or tolerance, but actual peace. The kind where his daughter could run toward her friends without fear, where she could laugh without calculation, where her wolf and her humanity could exist in harmony rather than conflict. Gareth appeared at his elbow, watching the children with a slight smile. 20 years of diplomacy. 3 months of strategic pressure. And it came down to making sure one little girl could go to school without being afraid. "It was never about just one little girl," Magnus said quietly. "It was about what allowing her suffering said about everything we'd built." And now, Magnus watched Naomi disappear into the cultural center, surrounded by friends, protected not by fear or force, but by systems that finally worked the way they should. "Now," he said, "I finally kept my promise." The Alpha King's vigil was over. The real work of peace could begin. If you enjoyed this journey, show some love with a like and stick around. Subscribe so you're here for the next story I drop.